Black Lodge Publishing welcomes you to a series of short talks on all things esoteric and occult. Today, in this talk, which will be the first of four, I'll begin to present some personal observations on the Ophidian current, and in particular, that of the importance of Kenneth Grant's presentation of atavistic resurgence and of its purpose in creative esotericism. If you've attended any of my lectures or read any of my books, then you will quickly realise that I'm interested and involved directly with that of activating and deploying what we call the Ophidian current. As such, as it weaved its path throughout several aeons, and where we first find evidence of its manipulation in the so-called dark dynasties of Egypt, otherwise pre-dynastic Nubia and Egypt. However, activation of this magical current and its tradition can be found not only in the ancient glyphs and iconography of those dark dynasties, but also and more recently being used in Western modern practice. Thus, most modern esotericists will perhaps be more familiar with this current as it flows through the magical works associated with Crowley, Osman Spare, Kenneth and Steffi Grant, and also how in particular the current can be magically activated through the use of the serpent fire, and which can then be utilised for that of more personalised and creative forms of esotericism. I therefore invite you to investigate the operations of the star and snake. For those who are interested more in the ancient origins, especially the hieroglyphics, I suggest reading The Flesh of Ra and the second volume of 3, The Chamber of Darkness, which I will be discussing in a future lecture. However, in this first short talk, my aim will be to demonstrate that of a link between the serpent or Ophidian current and indeed in that where the practitioner will first experience its first appearances, and this is directly related to what is termed atavistic resurgence. So, before we begin, the term atavism comes from the Latin atavus and refers to that of a remote ancestor. Or in biology, it can refer to the reappearance in an individual of characteristics of some remote ancestor and which are absent in intervening generations. Thus, from these definitions, magical practitioners might begin to recognise several reaffirmations of their own magical theory and practice. We might therefore ask, what is atavistic magic? How does it work? What does one experience when you magically activate and will that interstitial gateway to open? In one of Grant's and also Lovecraft's favourite writers, the Welshman Arthur McCann, we find in his novel The Black Seal, which was part of his 1895 Three Impostors, that Machan hints directly at a form of atavistic resurgence, and as he suggests, it is this that lies behind all forms of wizardry and witchcraft, including the appearance of devils, fairies, the white people, and indeed where its use is detailed in both ancient and modern magic. For as McCann's character in the story states, it is a black background of truth. He goes on, I was not wholly prepared to deny that human flesh may now and then, once perhaps in 10 million cases, be the veil of powers which seem magical to us. Powers which so far from proceeding from the heights and leading men thither are in reality survivals from the depths of being. For those more familiar with the shattering of the vessels in Kabbalah and those entities of the Nightside Cliff-off, will readily equate McCann's suggestion that these powers do in fact lie at the core of one's true being and can therefore be activated. Funnily enough, it is primarily in Kenneth Grant's novellas that we can also discover several clues to atavistic resurgence, and whereby some of his characters occasionally and unwittingly unleash these primal atavisms. Yet, and for those interested in a more controlled methodology and study, one need only read Grant's Typhonian trilogies, in which much of the background to the system is outworked, and especially in that of activating the Ophidian current. Nevertheless, as one begins to delve a little further into Typhonian magic, the answers to the specific use of these atavisms become somewhat a little trickier. I would at this point state that activation of atavisms remain a dangerous practice. That is, as one moves even closer to the so-called ninth arch, or even the ninth gate, for all of it depends on how the individual develops and then begins to understand their own philosophical schooling and practice behind it, and even more so on that of an individual's willpower and ability to concentrate. For as discussed in my Night of Pan, this is the point event or coming into being by the combined subject and object. Unfortunately for most, this involves deep states of meditation, but also and actually being able to stay awake, more humorously depicted by the Deppmeister during one of Boris Balkan's famous lectures on the great old protagonist, the devil himself. Grant poignantly notes that magical and spiritual practices often seek to cultivate altered states of consciousness, and for this reason, methods and rituals are designed not only to advance solar consciousness, but can also be used to regress it, that is, of activating an awareness of one's own lunar subconscious, and wherein we activate those atavisms. Yet, however, for you, the puzzle is how to discover and then actively stimulate this atavistic resurgence. The Grants would make use of several Crowleyan, and as we will also see, Osman Spare's magical themes for the basis of the IBA, and also in the establishment of their new Isis Lodge, e.g. that in Hidden Lore published in the 1980s, but the material in it itself dates from the late 50s. And yet, another good source can also be found in Crowley's Liber O Vel Manus et Sagittai sub figura sex. He states, 1. This book is very easy to misunderstand. Readers are asked to use the most minute critical care in the study of it, even as we have done in its preparation. 2. In this book it is spoken of the Sephiroth and the paths, of spirits and conjurations, of gods, spheres, planes, and many other things which may or may not exist. It's immaterial whether these exist or not. By doing certain things, certain results will follow. Students are most earnestly warned against attributing objective reality or philosophic validity to any of them. Crowley goes on, however. 3. The advantages to be gained from this, where he's talking about reality in general and the use of the magical will, he states, are chiefly these. A. A widening of the horizon of the mind. B. An improvement of the control of the mind. And then 4. If the student attains any success in the following practices, one will be confronted by things, ideas, and beings too glorious or too dreadful to be described. It is essential that one remains in control of all that one beholds, hears, or conceives. Otherwise, one will be the slave of illusion and the prey of madness. It was by way of Crowley's descriptions of certain magical processes that provided Grant with a neat canvas on which he could explore his own magical works, including that of developing his own brand of creative esotericism, which he delivered through his novellas and poetry. For as I have mentioned, we find that particularly in the novellas, several of Grant's characters undergo atavistic regression, resurgence, and then transformation. One soon discovers that these characters generate primeval behaviours, including those that some might be more familiar with from the Gothic revival. These include Ophidian, vampiric, lycanthropic, including the more ancient Saurian, and even the tormented sexual bloodlust of the hyena. What we are therefore being asked is whether these atavisms can be activated because they are still present and intact in the organism. Even although for most they seem to have been deactivated, or perhaps better, we might want to inquire whether they can be switched on and activated specifically for magical purposes, or left switched off. I conclude this first talk with my last slide, and which will no doubt provoke several questions, especially relating to other methods of activation covered in my following talks. but this one specifically relates to what we term in Greek ecstasis, or displacement. This form of activation is prevalent throughout history and involves enhancement or intoxication, drug use, including the use of entheogens, or that which induces the god within us effect, and thus is closer to activating atavistic resurgence. Evidence can be found in most ancient cultures from at least the Bronze Age, including illustrations of the saffron gatherers to the Cretan poppy goddess, and we also find in those more familiar mythopoeic characters such as Helen of Sparta, the witch Circe, the lotus eaters, and that of Medea, all of whom are said by the authors to have used drugs. However, in the Homeric epics, 8th century BC, some of these psychotropic materials are described in the Greek as causing men to forget their homes, but more importantly, and wherein we are given a vital clue in that of their purpose, and which does not, I stress, turn individuals actually into swine, nor indeed any other animals, and that their function is to draw out the individual's deep-rooted atavistic memory, and which induces in the fortunate or unfortunate individual the behavioural memory of that particular atavism. I therefore leave you with the following. Could certain psychic and magical abilities be linked to atavistic resurgence? Perhaps in most individuals they remain dormant or even switched off. Could they, for example, be activated through a form of subtle bioelectrical sensitivity, or perhaps better, a quantum sensitivity that has become repressed as our humanity supposedly advances? The question then is just how atavistically wired, or indeed atavistically weird, are we? I'll leave it for you, the listener, to decide. Until next time. Many thanks for listening, and please join us for part 2 by subscribing to Black Lodge Publishing on Facebook and YouTube.